to stop this week's rail strikes. Grant Shapps told MPs the RMT walkouts tomorrow, on Thursday and on Saturday are callous.
This strike today isn't about pay. It's about outdated unions opposing progress that will secure the railway's future.
Mr Shapps says the government is not involved in the talks as it's not the employer, but the General Secretary of the RMT, Mick Lynch, told LBC the train operating companies don't have a free hand.
We're meeting right now with one of these companies, the biggest one in the industry. They are working to a remit that is dictated by the Department for Transport, and when they want to suggest something, they have to go out and talk to them.
Barristers in England and Wales have voted to go on strike. Several days of court walkouts will begin from next week in a row over legal aid funding. Victims of grooming gangs in Oldham have received official apologies. A report commissioned by the Mayor of Greater Manchester says police and the local council failed to protect some youngsters from sexual exploitation, but concluded there was no official cover-up. A team from the Air Accidents Investigation Branch has been sent to North Yorkshire following a helicopter crash. 2 people died when it came down in a field near Burton in Lonsdale. In the city, the FTSE 100 closed up 105 points at 71.21. The pound buys $1.22 and €1.16. LBC weather, a dry, clear night for most. Tomorrow, the best of the sunshine in the south, cloudier in the north of the UK, a high of 24 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Andy Ivey.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening. It's Monday's Cross Question on LBC. It's 8:02. Our panel tonight is Peter Tatchell, human rights campaigner and director of the Peter Tatchell Foundation. Caroline Slocock is director of the Civil Exchange think tank. We'll find out a bit more about that in a moment. And she was also private secretary to Margaret Thatcher during the end of her time as PM. Brendan Clarke-Smith is a Red Wall MP, Conservative MP for Bassetlaw. He's been very trenchant in his defence of Boris Johnson. And Annalise Dodds is Labour Party Chair, Shadow Women and Equality Secretary and Labour MP for Oxford East. She'll be joining us momentarily on Zoom. You can phone 0345 6060 973. You can text your question to 84850 and you can watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Well, welcome to you all. Jerry in St Albans has our first question. Hello, Jerry.
Hiya, how are you?
Very well, thank you. What's your question, please?
Basically, I'm okay with them wanting the 11%, but I'd like to know
This is
how...
RMT members, yeah?
Yes, but how are we going to pay for that? Where is this extra money going to come from to accommodate their wages?
Okay, Brendan Clarke-Smith.
Well, I think that's the million-dollar question, if you'll excuse me talking about money. And I think, that's the point. You look across other sectors, people have had pay freezes before, but then they've had pay increases that haven't kept up with inflation. It's a very difficult period for us. We have got to balance the books. And again, there's a fairness argument there, really. I think if you look at some of the terms and conditions that are already there, whether it's retirement ages, whether it's working on Sundays, whether it's doing other things, there's some pretty good conditions that are already there. Now, I don't begrudge anybody a fair pay rise or a fair wage. Very difficult period at the moment. But again, I think 11% is a little steep. And the problem, of course, this is all due to inflation. If we keep paying people more and more money, inflation is going to get worse. And that's going to trigger off things like interest rate rises, which is, people's mortgages at the time.
But if you were a trade union leader, I can imagine you arguing the fact that, well, if inflation is 11%, our members, they can't have a cut in their standard of living, and anything below 11% would mean a cut in their standard of living, so therefore we can't accept anything less than 11%.
Well, they've got a job to do, and they wouldn't be doing it properly if they didn't push it a little bit, and it's a negotiation. And I respect that. I understand how trade unions work, but I think they've jumped the gun a little bit here. They've gone straight for the strike. I think there's a bit of negotiation they could have tried to do first before we actually got to this stage, and I think it's looking a little bit unreasonable. It's going to impact on a lot of vulnerable people in society who can't get to work, people who can't get to school, their hospital appointments, and I think they're really losing public support with this.
Peter?
I think we're looking at the wrong angle. Very clearly, the rail bosses are paying themselves hundreds of thousands, if not millions, in salaries and bonuses They're not cutting back. They're taking more and more and more out of the rail network, which could be used to help fund precisely the services and pay and conditions that the rail workers are asking for.
I'm sure there'll be many rail managers that are on over £1 million. There might be the old chief executive, I guess.
Yes.
That wouldn't go far in meeting an 11% pay rise.
Well, the principle is, if the bosses are taking as much as they can, they can't then turn around and point to the workers who are demanding what is, I think, a very reasonable increase given the cost of living crisis and inflation. Moreover, to answer the question originally, of course we can pay for it. There is plenty of money. In this country, we have 177 billionaires. The richest 250 people in this country have combined assets of £710 billion. They should, in my view, be subject to a wealth tax, a one-off wealth tax of, let's say, 10%. That would not leave them in poverty. They might have to sell one of their 6 houses or one of their private jets or private yachts, but that would raise £71 billion to help fund public services.
And then they would all leave the country and be domiciled elsewhere, so we'd never get their tax revenues in future years.
Well, I'm not so sure about that. Not all of it is.
You can see the logic, though, can't you?
A lot of it is tied up in assets in this country. And, if we upped it to, say, 20%, we talk about 140
Why not
billion.
go the whole hog and do 50%?
No.
I mean,
billionaires can easily afford to pay a 10 or 20% wealth tax.
Look, billionaires are billionaires for various reasons. I would hope that most of them are billionaires because they've actually made the money genuinely.
But they don't need that much. They don't need 5 houses around the world.
Just
they don't need
because you're
private
rich,
jets and
you
yachts.
don't necessarily have the readies to pay that kind of money. You're right. They would have to sell things. And frankly, a human reaction from them was say, well, if this is the way the country wants to treat me, I'm off. Well, we saw it in the 70s when tax rates were 98% on unearned income.
We're not talking about 98%. A 10 or 20% wealth tax would still leave them with vast assets, billions and billions and billions. Now, mostly they cannot spend that. So why shouldn't they contribute? Why shouldn't they be true patriots and contribute to help getting the economy out of this mess? Okay. If they really love the country, they'd be willing to make some sacrifices. They're not going to be walking around in sackcloth and ashes. They will have plenty of wealth still, but they will help contribute to solving the crisis.
Caroline Slocock.
I think it's a really good question. I'm not sure they actually are asking for 11%. I don't think they've declared a figure. Maybe they have, but they're being offered 2% plus an extra 1% if there are productivity changes. And that's a very small sum of money, really, given that inflation could go up to 11%, even 15% in some cases. Obviously there's a really big issue here, isn't it? Because this isn't just the trains. It isn't just the trains. It's not just the teachers who are now talking. It's a whole range of workers right across the economy who have already seen a fall in real terms in their pay over the last decade. And in the same period, we've had something called quantitative easing, which some people liken to throwing money.
I can never pronounce that, so well done.
Yeah, well, I would struggle too. But it is literally sort of throwing money at the economy, and it's benefited people with assets, people with shares and people with property. And it seems to me that actually at this point there is a need for some kind of national debate about this very serious issue, which is affecting people particularly on the lower end of the wage spectrum.
Well, because if you're on the lower end of the wage spectrum, the inflation rate is not 11%. It's probably
higher.
More like 15 to 20%, isn't it?
Exactly. And it's, these are often people who went out and, put their lives on the line during the COVID crisis. And, it's not that long ago, but it seems like ages, doesn't it, since, that solidarity, we talked about solidarity and how we all pull together. And now the kind of rhetoric that's coming out of the government, I'm afraid, is very much that we're not all in the same boat. There's them and there's us. And, they're pointing fingers at various people, but they're just simply trying to keep their wages up to a reasonable standard so they can feed people. Now, if we had some kind of wealth tax, I personally wouldn't just go for the billionaires. I think I would make it more wide-ranging. But that's one way of doing it. Another way is looking to employers to take fewer profits out of the economy. If this is a one-off, which we hope it is, don't we? We hope that the factors that are fueling inflation are one-off. Then maybe they should be contributing as a national effort that, to making sure that people can put, food on their children's plates. Because we've got a situation where nurses are often having to go to food banks in order to feed their families and themselves.
Let's take a follow-up question to this from Joanne in Harrow, who's texted this question in. It's being reported tonight that Labour frontbenchers are being told that they're banned from picket lines this week. Is this how the so-called Party of the Workers should be acting? Well, we'd love to put that question to Annalise Dodds, but it looks as if we've been stood up. Maybe she didn't want to answer that question. I don't know. Caroline, what do you make of that?
I mean, I don't know whether that's just a kind of made-up story that people are putting out there, because obviously the Conservative Party is putting so much energy. I mean, it's bizarre. They're writing letters to the Labour Party saying they're responsible for this when these your people are the party in power. But actually, I do think that we should not resile from the fact that strikes are part of our democracy. People have a right to strike. And I think the Labour Party is obviously worried about being caught in some kind of political trap, doesn't want to kind of say that it supports any kind of strikes, and I think that's a shame in a way, because I think they're part of our democracy. In this particular case, I'm as fed up as anyone at the kind of disruption that it's causing, but I just think we have to recognise that the Chief Secretary was absolutely clear on the radio this morning. I don't know if you heard him. He said, essentially, he came clean and he said this is about we have to keep levels down to 2 to 3%, because otherwise there'll be an inflationary spiral. And the rail workers are a test case, aren't they? But there's the whole line of people behind them who may want a pay increase.
Well, we talked about that in the last
what do they do if the government won't give this extra money? What are they supposed to do if they really are struggling to kind of maintain their mortgages, the food and so forth in their families?
I think it's quite appalling the government itself won't get involved in the negotiations to try and bring the sides together and find a solution. The fact the government's sort of saying it's nothing to do with us, I think, is an abdication of responsibility.
Well, in theory it isn't, because they're not the employer, are they?
Yeah, but they are responsible for the economy, and they are responsible that they partly fund the rail network.
There's ACAS to do that sort of thing. You don't necessarily... I mean, the Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps, would he be an asset round the negotiating table?
Well, he ought to be. If he wants to keep the country running and to avoid the strike, he ought to be intervening with a proposal to help solve the problem and to get a solution.
But the only thing he can do is come up with more money, and he's not going to do that, is he?
Well, he should tax his rich friends.
Don't think he's going to do that either.
Can I just say on that, Ian? Yeah, I mean, we've already put 16 billion. That's the equivalent of about £600 for every family in this country into supporting the rail industry at the moment. And I think there's this idea that everybody in the rail industry is on a low wage. I think the median wage is somewhere around 40-odd thousand-ish. London Underground, they're on strike as well. Their pay deal has been above inflation for a while, I believe. So it's not necessarily quite the same. So everybody is not all in it together in that sense. I mean, there are some quite noticeable differences, but as we said earlier,
haven't the RMT done a brilliant job?
But also, I mean, that figure isn't right. That figure, that average figure isn't right. It's 33.
It's 33 for the whole of the rail sector. You're absolutely right. And if you take the train drivers out,
and they're not involved in this dispute,
they are. Well, the RMT train drivers are. The ASLEF ones aren't, but the RMT ones
are. Well, I heard Mick Lynch say that they aren't, except for a few of them at this point.
I think you might have misheard that, if I may say so.
Well,
But going back onto Labour, Ian, they are very truly divided, the front bench there. Some have been very strident in their views in supporting the strikes. Others have tried to sit on the fence, and they're in this very awkward position. I suppose you look at the historic way the Labour Party has been funded. There's £250,000 from the RMT in the last 10 years. And
would you like to point out that the RMT are not affiliated to the Labour Party now, and they don't donate to the Labour Party? I mean, you always miss that bit out when you say that.
But of course, there were 5 MPs who spoke in favour, and £20,000 and so on, and that's been in the press as well. Now, of course, we have to declare donations. I don't suggest for any moment that it's not all above board, but you have to ask the question.
No, but you're insinuating that influences those MPs' public pronouncements. And if I don't know if you have any outside interests that are registered, if I was to suggest to you that you were influenced by anybody that paid you as a second job, you would jump down my throat and say, how outrageous.
It's always suggested, Ian, and that's why we have a register of interests, and unfortunately that's the way it is. And until we go to a system like like they have on the continent of state-funded political parties, which I'm not in favour of, you were always going to have that with donors and various other things. Now, I appreciate that people want to stand up for the members. I appreciate the labour movement, and obviously they're historically linked with unions, but at the same time, they're in a really difficult position here where the public are quite clearly angry, but they've still got to
just address the point that Peter made, that Grant Shapps should become involved in this and bring the two sides together. Because he argues, well, it's nothing to do with me, Gulf. I'm the Transport Secretary. I don't employ anybody. But he was very happy to intervene in the P&O dispute, wasn't he?
Yeah, and I think also you look at what Mick Lynch has said about not working with Tories, and there's been an argument over that. But Grant Shapps has been involved in many ways with the rail industry, of course. He's the Secretary of State for Transport, and we've been putting a lot of money in, and rail is a heavily subsidised industry, as it always has been. But at the same time, you cannot negotiate with somebody who doesn't want to negotiate. And when their first instinct is to go on strike straight away, I mean, do they really want better for their members, or do they want a war with the government as well? Is that the real objective?
You shook your head there, Peter, but that's exactly what they've done, isn't it? They've gone on strike before a formal offer has actually even been made, which is unusual.
They have been pushing for changes for quite a long time, for many months, and it's got nowhere. So my reading is that this is a last desperate measure. It's very clear the unions do not want to go on strike. The members are going to lose money, but they feel they're in a corner. And anybody in a corner will, of course, want to fight to get a fair deal. And, I think, talking about influence, Conservatives get so much money from business to back business interests. I can't tell you right now whether the rail network people are funding the Tory party, but I would chance it's very likely they are and have in the past.
They own a lot of shares in BP and Shell, I think, from the last week I've seen as well. So they have all sorts of investments, so there are interests everywhere.
Final word from you, Caroline?
Well, people in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. I mean, if there you are saying that unions are funding the Labour Party, but Nadine Dorries, when the vote of confidence went into Boris Johnson, was talking about 22 donors and saying that MPs like you should be looking at the 22 donors and before you make your decision about who should be our Prime Minister. 22 rich people, she was saying, should be deciding who our Prime Minister should be. So, John Major, in a recent speech, said that actually, although he hated the idea, he really thought that to clean up politics, we had to go to a situation where political parties have, state
funny
funding.
How he didn't do anything about that when he was Prime Minister, when he had far more serious allegations of sleaze, and
not against
even
him
this government's
personally.
had.
I mean, his MPs, but not his government.
He was
or
the
his
leader of the Conservative Party. He was Prime Minister. He could have introduced that legislation and didn't.
Absolutely. But, we've had Boris Johnson since, and I think he's a worked example, of how not to do government. And, we've got people like Robert Jenrick, who received donations from a property developer and made a decision in that property developer's favour.
That
is actually quite libelous, what you said there, because he was a minister. He did not receive donations in the way that you've just implied.
He did as an MP, personally.
I think we'd better make clear that as a minister, he did not receive any donations.
As a minister,
and
but as an
therefore
MP.
did not make a decision in that person's favour. Just want to stop you getting into any difficulties as well as involving us in any difficulties. Right, we had better move on. We're going to take more of your calls in a moment. 0345 6060 973. It's 19 minutes past 8.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
22 minutes past 8 on LBC. Peter Tatchell is with us. Caroline Slocock, Director of the Civil Exchange think tank, which does what? Promotes civil exchange, I imagine.
Well, yes, actually. It's about improving the way in which government and civil society work together. And, it's, for example, it's about drawing in the resources that there are there in the voluntary sector and the wider community to do things better. And one of the things which we're involved in is a leadership network, cross-sectoral leadership network, which is called A Better Way, which is about improving services, strengthening communities and building a fairer society. And it's about people sharing ideas about how we can make things better.
Okay. Peter Tatchell, I've said Peter Tatchell is here. Brendan Clarke-Smith is Conservative MP for Bassetlaw. And we were hoping to be joined by Annalise Dodds, but unfortunately, for whatever reason, she can't make it. So let's go to Kath in Bingley. Kath, what would you like to ask?
Hello, love.
Hi.
Yes, given that Ian Blackford and several others were recorded offering their support to the MP, but not really considering the victim of the sexual harassment, I think he should resign. I wonder what the rest of the panel think. I've certainly lost my respect for him now.
Well, I saw a tweet that he issued in 2017 saying that the SNP would have no truck with any allegations of this. There would be zero tolerance of any sexual abuse allegations. And, of course, people are quoting that against him now. It does seem to be that this scandal, I think we can call it a scandal, is growing in importance. Peter Tatchell, what do you make of this? I mean, we should point out that an SNP employee who worked for one of the SNP MPs, he complained that he was, never sure what the word to use is here, but he was molested by the SNP chief whip and nothing was done about it. Peter?
Well, we've heard it many times before that there should be a zero tolerance policy towards sexual harassment in society and including in Parliament. And this is just the latest of so many different scandals of, I think, is it 50 MPs that are under some kind of investigation for sexual harassment or sexual crimes even. It's a very bad example. And yet again, we see that there is an obfuscation and evasion, and people are being defended when quite clearly there is strong evidence they've committed behaviour that is not acceptable.
But these sorts of cases have happened in all parties, and yet it becomes a tribal thing, doesn't it? I mean, all political parties are tribes to one extent or another, so the instinct is always to circle the wagons and protect your own, and that's exactly what seems to have happened here, the release of this tape where Ian Blackford is heard saying we must all rally to the former Chief Whip's defence, and everyone was saying here, here, they all seem to be supporting that, and yet publicly was saying something completely different.
No, it is unacceptable and, typical of double standards and hypocrisy, which corrodes public trust and confidence in politicians.
Do you think that Ian Blackford should resign over that?
I'm not sure whether he should resign, but certainly I think some action needs to be taken. Maybe suspended from Parliament.
Caroline?
I mean, it's incredibly worrying, isn't it, that actually in the House of Commons, there are so many cases of sexual harassment.
Do you think it's any different from any other workplace?
But the numbers do seem very high. I mean,
Well, that's because maybe it's because we hear about them.
Yeah.
Whereas, I mean, if we were talking about a big multinational company, we wouldn't hear about them, would we?
I mean, I don't know if you know this, but I was the former chief executive of the Equal Opportunities Commission.
I do know that, yes.
And so part of my actual responsibilities was, in some cases, to initiate what we call statutory formal investigations into areas which had particular difficulty. And one of those was, for example, the armed services. There are places which I think do have toxic cultures. And one of the characteristics of those cultures is a sort of bullying culture. And the thing that I would observe about politics is actually it's a very kind of bullying, toxic culture. I mean, I'm sorry to say that, but when if you sort of an ordinary person just watching how the House of Commons behaves at Prime Minister's questions, it is extraordinarily sort of bullying and sort of, abrasive. And I just wonder whether that culture actually feeds through into how people are treated, the staffers and people who work for them. So I do worry about it, actually. I think it's possibly a symptom of a kind of broader issue, which is actually there's something not quite right about the way our politics works in this country. It's so aggressive. And I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Brenton?
I think that's a very fair point. I think in terms of numbers that were mentioned earlier, I think that maybe the Standards Commissioner came out and said it's not actually quite as high as that, but one is too many as far as I'm concerned. Now, I completely get people being supportive of colleagues, especially when they have difficulties, but we have to remember this has been investigated and there's actually wrongdoing that's been found there. And I think when you get to that point, I think you have to say, there have to be consequences to it, and there's a certain way of behaving in public life, which I completely agree with there. That recording that we heard, that was not doing that. It did go into that tribal thing. Now, I'm not going to say whether people should resign or not, or throw that around. That's a matter for the Scottish National Party. I think you can compare what's happened here with the gentleman in question, though. You could probably look at, say, what happened with Margaret Thatcher, who did a incredibly stupid thing, I think, with COVID, and was thrown out immediately. And I think if you compare the two of those and you ask the public which of the two was the more serious, there's perhaps a debate to be there and about fairness and in terms of how people are treated.
But the wider question here, where there seem to be so many of these incidents, I don't know what you did before you became an MP, but I mean, whatever sector you were involved in.
I was a school teacher and a head teacher for a while, so it's a very, very unusual workplace. People work very long hours. There's an alcohol culture there. There's a bit of a power issue as well, I think, as you're getting up with staff members as well, which I think if you look at a lot of these cases that are being raised, they're former staff members and so on, and there's quite clearly a line that's crossed there. It's a very high-powered, high-pressured job. People don't necessarily behave how they would behave outside of Parliament, which is wrong as well. So I think it's completely right that there's a cultural issue there. Sue Gray, I think, highlighted this. It's been going on for years. It's not a new thing at all, but certainly I'd like to see a little bit more professionalism, and I certainly think when wrongdoing has been shown up, at the very least apologise for it, and the more serious cases, obviously, you would expect them to be dealt with.
I mean, Peter, this power thing, and this happens in all sectors of our society, all kinds of workplaces. I think it happens in the media, for example, where there are some people who appear so powerful and influential that even if they do commit wrongdoing in whatever way, they seem to get away with it, where a junior person wouldn't. I mean, what can be done to address that?
I think you're right. Often these situations are a power imbalance where someone, maybe a member of Parliament or a government minister, whatever, just thinks they can get away with it. And there's that mentality that they're untouchable, that no one will dare speak out, that the potential for retribution to affect someone's future career will keep them quiet. And that is just a very, very bad way of doing politics, and a very bad atmosphere to have in Parliament, where people feel in that kind of situation where if someone is being sexually abused or harassed, they have every right and indeed a duty to speak out and to hold the perpetrator to account.
And often it's the victim who ends up suffering even more, because if they feel they're not being listened to, and that there's a feeling of further victimisation, which can lead to all sorts of consequences. Thank you very much for those answers. We'll come back to more of your calls in a moment. 0345 6060 973. You're listening to LBC. I'm Iain Dale. It's Cross Question. 8:30 is the time, and Andy Ivey has the news headlines.
Rail passengers face several days of disruption after talks between train operators and the RMT union failed to reach an agreement. Around 50,000 workers will walk out tomorrow, on Thursday and on Saturday, in a dispute over jobs, pay and conditions. The Transport Secretary says around 20% of planned services will operate, focused on key workers, main population centres and critical freight routes. Grant Shapps told the Commons the government is looking at requiring train operators to run a base number of services in the event of future strike action. 2 people have died after a helicopter crashed in North Yorkshire. It came down in a field near the village of Burton in Lonsdale. LBC weather, a dry, clear night for most, but rain in parts of Scotland and Northern Ireland. Tomorrow, the best of the sunshine in the south, a high of 24 degrees.
LBC.
At
Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
8:34 on LBC. Let me reintroduce my panel to you. Peter Tatchell, human rights and LGBTI campaigner and director of the Peter Tatchell Foundation. Caroline Slocock is director of the Civil Exchange think tank and, of course, was private secretary to Margaret Thatcher at the end of her time as PM and has written a very good book on it, which I published, but I'm no longer associated with the publishing company, so I feel I can plug it. It's called People Like Us, and it's a really, really good read. And Brendan Clarke-Smith is Conservative MP for Bassetlaw. He's yet to write a memoir, but at some point it comes to for every politician, doesn't it, I guess?
Well, eventually, yeah. Hopefully not for many years yet, Ian. But
you never know. Right, let's go to Pauline in Watford. Hello, Pauline.
Hello, Ian. Your comment about billionaires leaving prompted this thought to me. If Johnson Sunak do not pay the necessary appropriate inflation-proof salaries increases to our rails and public servants, isn't there likely to be a brain drain? Highly skilled people can walk and they can move on, you know. If I were the young people at this stage with any prospects for a future, because I have the qualifications, I might be going to Australia, as some GP friends of my friend has already done, or New Zealand, definitely not the USA with their gunslinging culture.
Okay. Well, I mean, you make a good point, because we're a much more mobile society than even back in the 1970s when we had similar problems. But there was a brain drain in the 1970s. It turned, I think there were a lot of graduates who did leave the country, partly because of the tax rates and inflation. Caroline, let's come to you first on this one. Do you fear a brain drain of young people?
Well, I think it's true that, this is a very tight labour market. There's a shortage of people. And
I was taking part in a seminar earlier on flexible working, and that one of the representative from a large company, which I better not name, she said that she's in the HR department, she interviews people and they come with a list of their demands, which would never have happened in
it
our day, would it?
It definitely changes the power. No, exactly. It really changes.
Imagine you walking to Margaret Thatcher with a list of demands.
Well, that was never going to happen. But, I think that actually, employers are in quite a strong position for asking for a pay rise. And I also think that there's some people who are very stressed. I mean, your caller mentioned the health service. And, the people who've worked in the health service have worked above and beyond, for this year and the previous year and the year before, and I think they're very tired. And I think it's there's an issue of money, but there's also an issue of feeling appreciated. And I think there's a real danger that people are going to just get very fed up at both the sort of the lack of money for their pay, but also the feeling that the government doesn't really care about them.
But would that really prompt someone to leave the country because they thought that they weren't appreciated or the government didn't care about them?
I think if they feel that, if you're working in the NHS and, it's just one stressful situation after another and things don't seem to be getting better, there's not proper investment in the NHS. It's not just in you, it's also the service in which you work. And if you feel you're not working in a world-class service, then you might decide to go off to Australia.
But you could make that argument for many, many sectors. It's not just the NHS.
I think teachers, it's another question. So really, it'd be interesting to hear Brendan's views about that. But I think, teachers, they're saying that their pay has fallen by 20% in real terms. And they've had a tough time.
In the 1980s, teachers were saying this. Teachers always say, even when their pay does catch up, and it has increased over the years, maybe not to where it ought to be, because I always think teaching is a profession and people lose that. Well, let's go to Brendan as a former teacher.
Well, the funny thing is, Ian, I was one of those people. When the financial crisis came, I actually went to live abroad. I went to live in Sweden and Norway and Romania, and I taught over there. Teaching wasn't brilliantly paid. It wasn't a badly paid job, but certainly not for the amount of work you do. And you look at your life choices, your qualifications, and so on.
Did you do that because of the crash?
Partly, yes. Wanted a bit of a change. The economy wasn't looking great. The housing market was hit as well. And I just fancied a bit of a change, really, I think, as a lot of people do. And I'd looked into the New Zealand option and all sorts, as people do. Ended up in Romania, got married and brought a doctor back. So I'm going to claim some credit for that, yeah. But I think this is the thing. And what we have to remember is when we put these salaries up, it's not the Prime Minister or the Chancellor that's paying for it. It's the taxpayer that's actually paying for it in the end. It's got to come from somewhere. We were talking about railways earlier. It's going to go up in fares, or it's going to be through taxes or through the Treasury or wherever it is eventually in some kind of way. And we really, really have got to keep inflation down. Now, we don't want to go to this low-wage economy. I think that was one of the reasons behind Brexit. We want people to be paid well. We kind of addicted to cheap labour, and I think what we're actually seeing is we're transitioning away from that now, and there's going to be some bumps in the road, certainly. But I want everyone to be paid a fair wage, but at the same time, if inflation's shooting up, really, we've got to keep that down, and that's the key thing.
We should make clear the doctor you brought back, you were married to.
I was married to her, yes. I'm still married to her, thankfully, and yes, hopefully still after this show.
I think it's not just about wages not keeping up with inflation and the general cost of living crisis. It's also about housing in particular. Housing is a huge issue for young people. No prospect for lots of young people ever owning a house. Rents are sky high. In big cities, we're seeing an exodus of some young people because they simply cannot afford to live there. And of course, that means those cities are deprived of people with skills that those cities need to survive. We need public service workers to keep London and other big cities going. And if people are going out to smaller towns because they can't afford rents or they can't afford to buy, then those big cities are going to be under increasing pressure.
And then the rail strikes, so they can't even commute back into work.
Well, yeah. I mean, it is a very, very dangerous situation in the sense that the viability of our economy and the ability to provide services is potentially under threat if people decide to pick up sticks and go somewhere else. I mean, in lots of parts of Australia, you can buy a decent house for half the price in the UK, and often the wages are higher. So people are thinking, why stay here?
Right, that was a really good question, Pauline. Thank you very much for phoning in. Chris in Richmond has got another one. Hello, Chris.
Good evening, panel. Good evening, Ian. Should we be concerned for our democracy when a national newspaper, i.e. The Times, pulls a story it's already published in print regarding the Prime Minister's wife being appointed to or attempted to be appointed to a civil service job?
So why do you think it was pulled?
Pressure from Number 10. I don't think a leading national newspaper like The Times, which is certainly unbiased and certainly not left-leaning, would pull that unless it was under exerting significant pressure from Number 10. It's very concerning as far as I'm concerned.
Just to provide a little bit of context to this, the story was by Simon Walters, who used to be political editor of the Mail on Sunday, who I know very, very well indeed. And I have every confidence that he would not have written this story were it not to be true. And he says he's got all the sources. He said Number 10 didn't deny it. The only explanation I can think of, if it wasn't political pressure, was that there was some legal issue, but the story had already been published in Michael Ashcroft's book on Carrie Symonds, and it's not a new story. So it is a little bit perplexing, isn't it, Brendan?
It's an unusual one, yeah, but I could give examples of myself where something's been printed or it's gone in print and there have been errors with it, and I've asked it to be corrected and the online version has changed or that's disappeared, but when it's already been printed, it's been printed, unfortunately. So I couldn't really comment too much on this one. I don't know the full details about it or what journalists do, but I do think it's important we have a free press. I believe we do have a free press in this country.
But if it's true that Number 10 did put pressure on the Times, that would indicate that our press isn't quite as free as we like to think it is.
Oh, well, politicians always try and put pressure on the press, and the press always try and put pressure on politicians. I think that's the nature of the sort of the cat and mouse game to an extent. I think it's a little bit different when you look at countries that censor the press. I know Peter's got a lot of experience in campaigning against this around the world, and I've got a great deal of respect for what he's been doing with that. So, you look at our country, I think we have a very free press in comparison to elsewhere. That doesn't mean we still can't get better, but I don't think there's anything untoward particularly. And as you said, maybe there are some other reasons that we don't know about.
Peter Tatchell.
It sounds curious and suspicious. That's all I can say.
It does sound curious. If that's all you want to say, we'll go on to Caroline.
Yeah, well,
I thought you'd have a lot more to say than that.
And I followed this story quite closely, and somebody sort of helpfully sent a picture of the paper with the story
I've seen
in,
it
and
too.
then a picture of the story that the paper put in to fill its space. And the story had a picture of Carrie Symonds as she was then. And the news story was Priti Patel says the European Court on Human Rights was racist in its decision. And it had a picture of Priti Patel sitting in exactly the same place as Carrie Symonds. Now, I mean, this to me is sort of 1984. I mean, this is really strange. I don't think I can remember in my lifetime an instance of something like this happening. And
you don't think that Bernard Ingham would have rung up William Rees-Mogg, the editor of the Times,
yes, but not,
and said, your story is bunkum and balderdash?
I'm sure he would, but whether that had an impact, is another matter.
I mean, Alistair Campbell would have done... I mean, he's been bleating on about this, but he would have done exactly the same thing.
Well,
did it many times. He had tame journalists on the Times.
Yeah, but the point about this was that it was actually published and then it was removed in a later edition. So actually people have got a physical copy of it. And the story itself is really interesting.
It is feasible that the lawyers could have intervened, because newspaper lawyers tend to be very conservative with the small c beasts.
But they would have checked that out before they did put the story.
Well, maybe they didn't then. Maybe that was the problem.
But come on. I mean, you said that the journalist was extremely careful. And also the story had been included in the book, which I'm sure would have gone through all of the lawyers. And, according to the journalist, the story had not been denied by anyone at Number 10. And the story itself is really interesting. You can see why it was so hypersensitive, because it cut right to the question of the integrity of the Prime Minister. I mean, what the story said was when he was Foreign Secretary and he was having an affair with Carrie Symonds when he was still married to his previous wife, he wanted to put her as Chief of Staff in his own office on a salary of £100,000. And people around him found out that he was having an affair and said, you really cannot do this. And somebody even threatened to resign. And
this is true. Alan Duncan wrote about it in his diary. So we know that the basics of the story are true.
Absolutely. And, I mean, first of all, this is a massive misjudgment on the man who is currently our Prime Minister. And his character and his judgment is, he's under probation, in my view. Secondly, he was using public money to help him to pursue his own affair with his mistress. And that is, breaking the ministerial code. And then, you get a situation where the Foreign Secretary, who we know has some strange, allegedly has some strange links with Russian individuals.
Do we?
I think we do. Lebedev and his father. Was this?
Oh, sorry, you're talking about Boris.
Boris, yes.
All right, sorry,
so Boris has.
I thought you were talking about Liz Truss. I was thinking, oh my God, here we go again.
No. But he was. When I was positively vetted as a civil servant, one of the things which became made clear to me, is that one of the worst thing you can have is have a secret, because you can be blackmailed. And he was the Foreign Secretary, who was doing something which was, doubly incriminating, and he had to be stopped from doing it by others saying that they would resign, and it was I think the words were an insane.
Because if no one had known about the affair, to be fair to Carrie, she was eminently qualified to do that.
Well, I think that one of the points that was being made, according to the article, was that she wasn't very well qualified. I mean, she'd been...
She was.
Well...
I mean, she'd been head of press at the Conservative Party.
Yeah, but...
she'd been special advisor to various cabinet
I'm
ministers.
not really qualified to comment on that, but all I'm saying is that one of the people in the article was said to have said that she was, did not have the right qualifications for the job. But the point is, this is not a good moment for this story to appear in the newspaper.
It would have been worse if it had been 3 weeks ago, it has to be said.
Yeah, but, it's the drip, drip, drip. Yeah. Isn't it? I mean, we know, well, certainly, Jessie Norman says that it's the Prime Minister's technique to try and change the conversation and, go into campaign mode. And, that's what he's doing now. And then this story drops in and then suddenly it's lost.
Well, it hasn't had a huge amount of comment on the media over the past 48 hours, I think, but we've put it right here anyway. It's 8:48.
LBC